Airports have their own kind of heartbeat. It doesn't tick like a clock or flow like a melody. It pulses, restless, uneven, alive. The echo of footsteps on polished floors, the steady rumble of suitcase wheels dragged behind hurried travelers, the rise and fall of voices in dozens of languages, blending into a single hum of anticipation. Overhead, the metallic voice of announcements breaks through. Gates opening, flights delayed, boarding groups called like rituals. That evening, as I walked toward my gate, I felt as though I had stepped into a place that belonged to no one and everyone, all at once. An in-between space suspended somewhere between departure and arrival, where strangers shared the same air for a brief heartbeat of time before scattering again. I clutched my boarding pass in one hand. It was just paper, flimsy and printed in ink that could smudge, and yet I held it as though it were something sacred, more than a ticket, a key, a promise, a doorway. Around me, people carried their own small universes, parents corralling sleepy children with stuffed toys, a businessman muttering into his phone, students with oversized backpacks slouched against the walls. Everyone with their own destination, their own reason for being here, their own invisible thread pulling them into the sky. The smell of the place clung to me. Roasted coffee dristing from kiosks, fried food lingering from hurried dinners, the faint, unmistakable tang of aviation fuel that seeped in through the glass walls. Beyond those walls, the runways stretched endlessly, painted with bright lights that blinked against the dusk. Planes glided across them like enormous silver birds, their wings gleaming as they caught the last embers of sunlight. I stopped to watch, pressing my palm against the cool glass. There is something humbling about knowing you will soon be one of those tiny figures rising into the sky, leaving the world below smaller and smaller until it seems almost imagined. There's always a moment before boarding when I ask myself if I should turn back. Not out of fear, I've flown before, and I know the routine, the takeoff, the hum of the engines, the tilt of the plane, but each time it feels like stepping across a threshold, as if the person who walks down the jet bridge won't be quite the same as the one who emerges hours later. Flying changes you in small, invisible ways. It rearranges the map of your perspective, forces you to see the world not as endless ground, but as something fragile, suspended, whole. My gate was crowded. People shifted impatiently, checked their phones, adjusted their bags. Some looked exhausted, others excited, others simply blank with routine. I wondered what stories they carried, what goodbyes or beginnings were folded into their journeys. I would never know. And yet, for a few hours, we would all share the same space, breathe the same thin air above the clouds, trust the same pair of wings. When they finally called my row, I rose with the others. My bag pressed heavy against my shoulder. My pulse quickened, not with anxiety, but with anticipation. I took one last look at the glass wall, at the line of light stretching across the runway, and thought, this is why I fly. Not just to arrive somewhere new, but to leave something behind, to see the sky differently, to see myself differently. I stepped forward, toward the gate, toward the plane waiting in the dimming light. And though I didn't yet know it, this flight would leave behind more than just a contrail dissolving in the clouds.
The cabin welcomed me with its familiar mixture of scents, metal, recycled air, the faint chemical trace of fuel that seemed to follow us in from the jet bridge. I slid into my seat by the window, letting my bag thud against the floor as I tucked it beneath the chair in front of me. For a moment, I rested my forehead against the cool plastic wall, staring at the oval frame of the window. Outside, the wings stretched out into the fading light, sharp and elegant, the sunset painting its silver skin with streaks of gold and rose. Passengers flowed in slowly, each carrying their own urgency, their own exhaustion, their own hopes. A man in a suit collapsed into the seat across the aisle, already tugging at his tie, his shoulders slumped as though the whole weight of the day had followed him on board. 2 rows ahead, a young woman bent to tuck a small blanket around a child who clutched a stuffed rabbit so tightly it looked like it might dissolve. The child's eyes were wide, a mix of fear and wonder, and I felt a sudden pang of recognition. I had looked out of airplane windows like that once too, trying to understand how something so heavy could rise into the sky. Behind me, 2 friends spoke in voices too loud for the enclosed space, laughter bursting in quick, bright sparks. Their joy felt contagious, even comforting, reminding me that for some, flying wasn't routine but adventure. I smiled to myself, leaning back into the seat, letting their excitement soften the edge of my own anticipation. Flight attendants glided through the narrow aisle, their steps measured, their faces calm but efficient. Their movements were a dance of habit. Overhead bins shut with practiced force, life vests demonstrated with motions so polished they looked almost graceful. Seatbelts tugged and tightened with a reassuring click. The cabin seemed to breathe with them, filling slowly with the low hum of passengers settling in. It was the sound of surrender, hundreds of strangers agreeing, without words, to trust a pair of wings. I pulled the safety card from the pocket in front of me, tracing the little diagrams with my finger, the neat rows of emergency exits, the masks falling like white blossoms from the ceiling, the arrows pointing toward doors I hoped I'd never need. I knew it all by heart, but I still looked every time. Maybe it was ritual, maybe superstition, maybe just the comfort of familiarity. When I slid the card back, I did so carefully, smoothing its edges against the pocket as though that gesture itself kept us safe. The cabin lights dimmed, glowing soft and amber, and the engines coughed awake beneath us. The vibration rose through the floor, subtle at first, then steadier, stronger, a living heartbeat under our feet. My own pulse quickened to meet it, syncing with the rhythm of machines preparing to defy gravity. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, calm, almost fatherly. Cabin crew, prepare for departure. People barely looked up. Some were already headphones, some turned pages in their books, some closed their eyes as though sleep could arrive before takeoff. Yet I felt the electricity in the air, a collective awareness that we were all about to leave the certainty of the ground. I pressed my palm lightly to the window, feeling the faint thrum of the engines through the wall. Beyond the glass, the runway stretched out endlessly, lit with blue and white lights that winked in the dusk like a constellation drawn onto the earth. The wings shimmered faintly in the dying light, waiting, ready. And in that moment, I thought, here it comes. The tilt, the rush, the instant where the ground lets us go and the sky becomes ours.
The engines deepened their growl, a sound that seemed to rise not only through the floor but through my body itself, vibrating in my ribs, making every nerve hum. The plane shuddered as though impatient, eager to break free. My fingers tightened around the armrest, not from fear but from awe, that peculiar anticipation before the impossible happens. We rolled slowly at first, the cabin swaying with each bump in the taxiway. Through the window, the world looked calm, deceptively ordinary. Ground staff waving batons, trucks humming, other planes parked like resting giants. Yet beneath that calmness, I knew we were moving toward something extraordinary. The nose of the aircraft aligned with the long ribbon of runway, and for a breath, everything grew still. Then came the surge. Acceleration pressed me back into my seat, stronger and stronger, as if invisible hands were shoving me into the sky. The roar grew immense, drowning out even my own heartbeat. Lights lining the runway blurred into streaks, racing faster than my eyes could follow. The vibration smoothed into a pure, unstoppable force. Then, with a subtle tilt, I felt it. The moment when the ground let go. My stomach dropped in that delicious, terrifying way, and suddenly the runway was falling away beneath us. The houses, the streets, the cars became toys, shrinking by the second. The city that had felt so large only minutes before was now nothing more than a patchwork quilt, stitched from roads and roofs and rivers. I pressed my forehead against the window, wide-eyed, unable to look anywhere else. There's something humbling about watching the earth recede. All the things that felt heavy and complicated, deadlines, arguments, worries I carried like stones, seemed impossibly small from here. Problems looked like dots. Even the roads, those endless lines I had traveled so often, were nothing more than faint scratches in the landscape. Above the clouds, I realized life rearranges itself. The sky doesn't care for our noise. It offers perspective, whether you ask for it or not. The engines leveled into a steady hum as we pierced through the first wisps of cloud. For a moment, mist streaked the windows, a white veil closing us off from the world below. Then, with a sudden burst, we broke through into open blue. It was dazzling. The sun, nearly set below the horizon, painted the cloud tops in molten gold. They stretched endlessly, a sea of cotton waves glowing as if lit from within, and we, impossibly, were floating above it all. I caught my reflection in the glass, my eyes wide, lips parted, almost childlike. Flying had become routine for so many, a practical way of getting from one city to another. But in that moment, it was magic again, the kind of magic you can't explain without sounding foolish, a miracle disguised as machinery. Around me, life inside the cabin carried on. The businessman had already pulled out his laptop, fingers clicking furiously, as though deadlines could chase him through the sky. The child with the stuffed rabbit gasped aloud, his tiny face pressed flat against the window, awe radiating from him. His mother smiled, exhausted but tender, whispering something I couldn't hear. Behind me, the two friends cheered softly, like kids on a roller coaster, high-fiving at every bump of turbulence. And then there was me, suspended between them all, caught between routine and wonder. I felt a strange warmth rising in my chest, a mix of gratitude and longing. Gratitude that I could witness this, to rise above the earth, to look down on the life I thought I knew. Longing because I wish I could hold on to this clarity forever, bottle it and drink from it whenever the ground pressed too heavily against me. The flight leveled, the seatbelt sign pinged off, and people shifted in their seats, reaching for books, for headphones, for drinks. But I stayed leaning against the window, unwilling to look away. The sky outside was alive, streaked with fading pinks and deepening blues, scattered with clouds that glowed like embers. We were no longer climbing. We were cruising, gliding through a world most people never see for more than a few hours at a time. And I thought, this is why I fly. Not only to arrive somewhere, but to remember that life is larger than my corner of the earth. To remember that the sky is always waiting, patient and infinite, if I am only willing to rise into it.
Time in the sky does not move the way it does on the ground. Down there, minutes drag or race, tied to traffic lights, office clocks, the buzz of phones demanding answers. Up here, it stretches and softens, untethered like the clouds themselves. I watched the sun dip lower, sliding beneath us now, so that the world was bathed in a strange double light, gold from the horizon, silver from the moon that had already climbed high above. The cabin dimmed to match it, lights lowered to a warm glow, as if the plane itself wanted to remind us that we were between worlds. Around me, people began to dissolve into their own private orbits. The man in the suit who had collapsed across the aisle now had his laptop open, his face lit by the cold glow of the screen. He typed with fierce determination, as though his office deadlines could follow him even into the sky. 2 rows up, the young mother had managed to coax her child to sleep. The stuffed rabbit drooped against his small chest as his mouth fell open in a deep, unguarded slumber. Behind me, the friends who had been laughing so loudly now wore headphones, shoulders leaning together, sharing some private soundtrack that made them grin even in silence. It struck me how different we all were, and yet how the sky had bound us together. For these hours, we were all passengers on the same vessel, breathing the same thin air, trusting the same wings. We were strangers, but also companions in an invisible community, a floating village hurtling across the sky. And maybe that was why I couldn't stop glancing around, cataloging their little worlds. The way the flight attendant tucked a blanket over the older woman and wrote 23 without being asked. The way a teenager scribbled in a notebook furiously, her pen scratching against the paper as if she feared the words might escape before she caught them. The way the man at the window, 3 seats ahead, stared outside for so long, I wondered if he too was chasing clarity in the clouds. I leaned back into my own seat, drawing the thin airline blanket over my knees, and let myself feel it, that strange communion of solitude and togetherness. Up here, suspended between departure and arrival, we were stripped of context. No one cared what jobs we had, what arguments we'd left unfinished, what plans waited on the other side. For a little while, we were only souls in transit, anonymous but united. The hum of the engines became hypnotic, a steady vibration that seemed to settle into my bones. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm carry me. There was peace in that sound, an assurance that, despite the turbulence of life below, up here the path was steady, the direction sure. When I opened my eyes again, the window was framed in darkness, but the stars had arrived, more of them than I had seen in years, brilliant and scattered, shining as though they were ours alone. I touched the glass lightly, my fingertips leaving faint smudges, and thought about how rare it was to feel this way. On the ground, it was so easy to believe I was separate, isolated in my worries, tangled in my own small story. But in the air, among strangers, I felt something different, a kinship, a reminder that we are all passengers, all moving through time and space together, all hoping the wings that carry us will hold. The hum of the engine stirred again when the attendants rolled out their carts, the smell of coffee and tea drifting between the rows. People spoke in low voices, asked for water, for snacks, for something to soften the hours. I accepted a cup of tea, its heat seeping into my palms, and leaned back once more. The taste was bland, but comforting in its ordinariness. It anchored me to the moment, to the strange, fragile village we had built in the sky. And as I watched steam rise from my cup and dissolve into the recycled air, I realized that flying wasn't only about leaving or arriving. It was about this, the pause in between, the community of strangers, the reminder that even high above the ground, we are never truly alone. It started with the smallest tremor, a quiver in the cup of tea balanced on my tray table. Just a ripple, nothing more. But in this sealed world of the cabin, even ripples speak loudly. I felt the engine shift, the steady hum dipping into a growl, and then the floor beneath me jolted once, twice. People stirred, eyes glancing up in unison, like a flock of birds sensing a change in the wind. The plane lurched again, more firmly this time, and my stomach pitched with it. The seatbelt sign blinks back to life, chiming with that bright little sound that always feels sharper than it should. Flight attendants moved briskly down the aisle, their faces calm, but I could see the tension in their eyes. They crouched quickly to secure loose items, checking belts, pressing hands gently to the shoulders of passengers who hadn't fastened theirs. I gripped the armrest, not in fear exactly,
but in recognition of how little control I had. We were suspended thousands of feet above the earth, hurtling forward on wings of metal and faith. The cabin rattled, overhead bins shuddering. The child with the stuffed rabbit whimpered, his mother holding him tighter, murmuring words only he could hear. The man in the suit shut his laptop with a snap, his jaw set tight. Behind me, the two friends tried to laugh, their voices forced, too high, like people whistling in the dark. The turbulence deepened. A sudden drop made my stomach slam into my ribs, a gasp rising unbidden from my throat. I heard others exhale sharply, a chorus of breaths drawn tight. It was strange, almost beautiful, how in that instant we were no longer strangers. Fear stripped us of our separateness. Every person in that cabin was bound by the same question, silent but shared. Will we be all right? The plane rocked side to side, shivering like a living thing caught in a storm. The tea on my tray splashed over, staining the napkin, and I didn't even care. I pressed my forehead against the window and saw only darkness. No horizon, no ground, just the endless black of sky. It felt both terrifying and humbling, like being reminded of my own smallness. And yet, in the midst of it, something unexpected stirred in me. Not panic, but connection. I looked around at the faces lit by dim cabin light, anxious, pale, determined, and I thought, we are together in this. Every soul here for this brief time is part of my life. If this sky trembles, it trembles for all of us. The plane shuddered once more, hard enough that a few people cried out. Then slowly, gradually, the motion eased. The growl of the engine steadied, the rattling softened, the tremors quieted until the plane was gliding again, smooth as silk. A collective breath released into the air, the sound of 100 lungs exhaling at once. The captain's voice returned, calm, measured, like a hand on the shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, we've passed through a patch of rough air. Everything is fine now. Please remain seated for a little while longer. The announcement was short, but it carried more weight than any sermon. It was the reassurance we needed. Fragile, but enough. Around me, people shifted, loosening their grips, trading small, nervous smiles. The child had fallen back asleep in his mother's arms, his rabbit still clutched tightly. The man in the suit reopened his laptop, though slower this time, his hands trembling just slightly. The two friends behind me whispered about how that wasn't so bad, their laughter more genuine now, relief laced through it. I sat back, heart still racing, but calmer. My hands smelled faintly of spilled tea, my knees ached from tensing so hard, and yet I felt something profound. For those few minutes, we had been united, stripped of our differences, joined by vulnerability. And in that unity, I had found something strangely comforting. Proof that even in the sky, where everything feels fragile, connection is stronger than fear.
The quiet that followed the turbulence was unlike any silence I had ever known. It wasn't empty. It wasn't awkward. It was thick with relief. Like the air after a storm when the last raindrops still cling to leaves, but the thunder has rolled far away. The engines hummed with steady confidence again. The lights above glowed in their soft amber hue. And yet every movement inside the cabin seemed altered. People shifted in their seats with more care, as though the rattling had made them realize how fragile all of this truly was. I saw it first in the man across the aisle. He had opened his laptop again, the cold blue light illuminating his face. But this time, his posture was different. He no longer leaned forward like a man in battle. Instead, his hands hovered over the keys, his eyes lingering longer on the window beside him. He typed a few lines, then stopped, resting his fingers against the plastic shell of the armrest. After a minute, he closed the computer altogether and simply sat there, breathing. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing. But to me, it looked like surrender. Not defeat, but the rare surrender of someone who finally allows himself to be still. 2 rows ahead, the young mother had her child curled in her lap, his stuffed rabbit drooping over his tiny chest. He had fallen asleep during the turbulence, lulled perhaps by the rocking of the cabin or the protective cocoon of her arms. She smoothed his hair back gently, her fingers trembling a little from leftover adrenaline, but her expression was one of softness, almost awe. When the flight attendant leaned down to offer her a bottle of water, she smiled, her gratitude radiating in a way that warmed me even from a distance. It was the smile of someone who has just witnessed fear pass safely, who knows how easily the story might have been different. Behind me, the 2 friends had gone quiet. Their earlier laughter had been too loud, a kind of bravado against nerves. But now it was softer, more real. I caught fragments of their whispers, jokes about roller coasters, promises to buy each other a drink once they landed. They laughed again, but it was different this time. Not the laughter of distraction, but the laughter of relief, tinged with tenderness. That sound made me smile to myself because I knew it meant they had felt it too, that invisible line between strangers cracking for just a moment, showing how vulnerable we all are. Even the flight attendants, those practiced keepers of composure, seemed changed. Their steps were still brisk, their smiles still professional, but there was something more in the way they leaned down to check on passengers, their hands brushing shoulders or tucking blankets in more snugly. I watched one crouch beside an older woman in row 23, making sure her seatbelt was comfortable, her voice low and kind. These gestures, as small as they were, seemed amplified now, carrying the weight of comfort in a place where comfort had briefly vanished. I sat back against my own seat, my tea long spilled, the stain drying into the thin napkin, my hands idly tracing the edge of the plastic cup. My heart had slowed, but my body still carried the echo of tension, the memory of tightening every muscle when the plane had dropped. And yet the emotion rising me now wasn't fear. It was closeness, an intimacy with these strangers that I hadn't felt before. For those minutes when the sky shook us like dice in a cup, we were not separate individuals anymore. We had been one body, one breath, one question whispered into the dark. Will we be all right? And the answer, unspoken but true, was yes. I turned my face to the window. Outside, the night had deepened. The stars were countless, more than I'd seen in years, scattered across the black in sharp silver points. From the ground, we forget how vast the sky is, how many lights pierce its fabric. Up here, it felt as though they belonged to us alone, a private constellation for this one flight, this one group of souls carried together through the air. My fingertips pressed against the cool glass, leaving faint smudges, and I thought, this is why I love flying. Not only to rise, not only to arrive, but to be reminded of how small I am and how deeply connected to everyone else who dares to lift off the ground. The attendants rolled their carts down the aisle again, offering drinks and snacks with gentler voices than before. People responded more warmly now. The businessmen accepted a cup of water with a quiet thank you that sounded genuine, almost tender. The young mother cradled her bottle and smiled in return. One of the friends behind me asked for tea, her voice softer than the loud, joking tone she had carried earlier. And when I accepted another cup, lukewarm and bland, it tasted better than any luxury, because it was proof that we were steady again, that life in the cabin had returned. Steam curled from my cup, rising into the recycled air before vanishing. I stared at it, strangely moved by its fragility. The turbulence had reminded me how fragile we all were, and yet also how enduring. Fragility and endurance, two truths that coexist, like sky and ground, like fear and relief. And so I leaned back, sipping slowly, the blanket pulled tighter over my knees. Around me, strangers shifted, whispered, laughed softly, breathed in sync with the hum of the engines. And I thought, maybe the real turbulence isn't in the sky at all. Maybe it's inside us, in the way we rush, in the way we convince ourselves we must carry everything alone, and maybe the gift of flying, of being lifted above the earth, is to remind us that we are never as separate as we believe.
The plane had settled into its steady rhythm, engines humming like a lullaby woven through the cabin walls. The seatbelt sign was off again, and people moved quietly in the aisles, stretching their legs, shifting their children, reaching for the overhead bins with careful fingers. Yet around me, calm reigned. The earlier turbulence felt like a distant dream now, though my body still carried a trace of it, the way you carry the echo of a wave long after it has receded from the shore. I leaned into the window, pulling the thin airline blanket tighter around me. Outside, the sky had become a canvas unlike anything I'd ever seen from the ground. The stars burned more fiercely up here, unsoftened by atmosphere or city lights. They scattered themselves in endless patterns, so sharp they seemed close enough to touch. Below us stretched a sea of clouds, luminous in the faint moonlight like a silent ocean of silver. I pressed my palm against the glass, smudging it with warmth, and felt the strangeness of it all, that I, a girl who often felt so rooted in her worries, was flying through this vastness, untethered and free. Up here, life rearranged itself. The things that pressed so heavily on me down below, the deadlines, the expectations, the constant sense that I was behind, looked impossibly small from this height. Even the city, once a tangle of streets and lights, was gone now, swallowed by darkness and distance. It reminded me that perspective isn't just a metaphor. It is real, visceral, available if we only dare to rise above what confines us. I found myself thinking of my great-grandmother, of how she had taught me to straighten my back and face life with steadiness. She had never flown in a plane, never left the ground in this way. Yet I carried her here with me, in the way my hands rested calmly in my lap, in the way I found discipline even in stillness. I wondered what she would say if she could see me now, staring out at the curve of the ether, realizing that the sky is not just something to look at, but something to inhabit. Around me, passengers had slipped into their own small worlds. Some slept, mouths slack, dreams unspooling in the air. Some read, pages turning softly. A pair of teenagers leaned their heads together, sharing a screen, their faces aglow with the flicker of a film. And yet, despite our separateness, I felt tethered to them all. We were suspended together in this fragile vessel, fragile bodies, in an infinite sky. That shared vulnerability created a strange intimacy, one that felt almost sacred. I shifted in my seat and caught my own reflection in the window. The face staring back was familiar, but different somehow. My eyes looked softer, wider, as though they had absorbed some of the vastness outside. I realized that this was the gift of flying, not simply the distance traveled, but the transformation that happens when you rise above the ground. Each flight is a quiet invitation to see yourself differently, to change your inner sky. The engines purred, steady and sure, carrying us forward. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound seep into me. I thought about how rarely I allowed myself to pause, to breathe, without rushing. Up here, there was no choice but to surrender, to trust, to let go of control and let the wings do their work. And in that surrender, I found something I hadn't expected: peace. When I opened my eyes again, the horizon was faintly glowing. Not dawn yet, but the promise of it.
a thin line of light that whispered, "Change is coming. You can't see it fully yet, but it's there." And I smiled because I felt it not only outside the window, but inside me as well.
It was somewhere over the ocean, or maybe a stretch of land I couldn't name in the dark, when the man in the seat beside me finally spoke. Until then, he had been a shadow at the edge of my awareness, quiet, polite, absorbed in a book whose title I hadn't managed to glimpse. He had the kind of stillness that makes you hesitate to disturb it. But as I shifted, stretching my legs and brushing a crumb from my blanket, he glanced sideways and said softly, "Do you ever get tired of looking out the window?" His question startled me. Most people looked once or twice, sighed at the clouds, then retreated into their screens. I shook my head, smiling faintly. Never. It's the only part of flying I love without reservation. He nodded, closing his book and tucking it into the seat pocket. I feel the same. It's like a reminder that we're small, and that's not always a bad thing. His voice carried the low calm of someone used to being heard, but not demanding to be. For a moment, we sat in silence, both turning our eyes toward the glass. The stars outside shimmered, undimmed by city lights, and the clouds below looked like a frozen ocean. He tapped a finger lightly against the armrest, almost hesitant, then said softly, "Every time I fly, I think about how everyone down there is living their whole story, and we're just passing over. It makes me wonder how many people I'll never meet, and how many of them might have changed me if I had." I turned to study him, surprised by the thoughtfulness in his words. He was older than me, perhaps in his 40s, with lines that suggested both laughter and worry. "Do you ever feel that maybe even the strangers you don't meet still change you? Just by existing, by shaping the world you pass through?" His eyes flicked toward me, and he smiled. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes, maybe so. We spoke quietly after that, voices lowered to avoid waking the sleeping passengers around us. He told me he was traveling for work, something about meetings and reports, though he didn't linger on details. I told him about design projects, deadlines that followed me even into the clouds. Yet, beneath those words, our conversation kept circling back to the same theme: how perspective changes when you're above the earth, how distance makes room for truths we ignore on the ground. At one point, he asked me, "And when you land, do you keep that perspective?" The question sat heavy in my chest. I wanted to say yes, but honesty won. "Not always," I admitted. "Most days it slips away before I even leave the air part. But I think, even if I forget, it stays somewhere inside, waiting until I look up again." He nodded as though he understood. Maybe that's enough, to know it's still there, even when you can't feel it. We fell into silence again, not awkward, but companionable. The kind of silence you share with someone who has seen the same horizon as you and knows it means something. I leaned back, eyes still on the stars, and realized that I would probably never see him again. He would land, go to his meetings, return to his life. I would chase my own deadlines, keep building my days. And yet for a brief time in the sky, our stories had touched. I smiled to myself because that was the hidden gift of flying. Not just the view, not just the escape, but the fleeting connections born in the space between departure and arrival. They didn't need to last forever to matter.
The night stretched on, steady and quiet, until the first suggestion of dawn began to gather at the edge of the horizon. At first I thought it was a trick of my tired eyes, a faint silver line where the blackness should have been unbroken. But as minutes passed, the glow grew stronger, pulling color back into the sky like a painter waking from sleep. I leaned closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass, and felt the familiar thrill of being witness to something that never truly repeats itself. The clouds below, once frozen in the pale light of the moon, shifted into something softer, alive. Hints of pink stretched across their edges, followed by faint gold, then a wash of amber so vivid it looked like the earth itself was on fire beneath us. It was as though someone, unseen and tireless, was painting each cloud individually, refusing to leave a single one untouched. From behind me came a soft murmur, a gasp of surprise. Other passengers had noticed too. One by one, heads turned toward the windows. Conversations trailed off, laptops closed without protest. Even the restless child, half asleep in his mother's arms, blinked and sat upright, his stuffed rabbit pressed to the glass as though it might catch the light for him. The man beside me stirred from his doze, rubbed his eyes, and when he saw it, he smiled. Not politely, not distantly, but with the open wonder of someone who still believed the sky could surprise him. That smile mirrored my own, and for a moment, we simply sat there, strangers bound by the same horizon. There's something different about watching a sunrise from above the clouds. On the ground, dawn creeps. It stretches and hesitates, slipping softly into corners, coaxing shadows away a little at a time. But up here, it does not creep. It arrives. The stars vanished as if they were never there, swallowed whole by light. The darkness doesn't retreat, it surrenders completely. 1 minute the world is asleep in shadow, and the next it is drenched in gold so pure it feels almost holy. I pressed my palm against the window, the glass cool beneath my skin, and felt tears sting unexpectedly at the corners of my eyes. Not sadness, something else, gratitude, release. This sense that I had been allowed to witness something larger than myself, something no photo or story could ever contain. In that blaze of light, something shifted in me. I thought of the turbulence, the trembling cups and frightened breaths. I thought of the silence afterward, the strange tenderness that had grown among us. I thought of the man's quiet words, maybe that's enough, to know it's still there even when you can't feel it, and realized that, yes, he was right. This sky was proof. The beauty was always there, waiting. I only had to look up. On the ground, I so often forgot to do that. Life bent me down over my work, my deadlines, my phone, my endless attempts to keep up. I lived hunched, as though the weight of everything I carried kept me staring at the floor. But here above the earth, the sky insisted on being seen. It pulled my gaze upward and held it without mercy, reminding me that perspective is not just a concept but a physical truth. When you rise, the world rearranges. Problems shrink, priorities clarify. Around me, the cabins seemed transformed. People who had been strangers an hour ago now leaned together, pointing out shapes in the clouds, whispering to each other about the colors bleeding across the sky. The man in the suit had abandoned his laptop entirely, his face pressed close to the window. The two friends behind me snapped quiet photos, their laughter hushed but joyful. Even the flight attendants paused in their routines, glancing out as they moved, their smiles softening as they too gave in to the wonder. For those minutes, we were united again, not by fear this time, but by awe. Suspended thousands of feet above the earth, we were children once more, looking at something greater than ourselves, unable to explain it, unwilling to look away. The plane glided steadily forward, its wings cutting through the sea of clouds, which now glowed like molten gold. I leaned my cheek against the wall, watching the sun emerge fully, a burning coin rising into its rightful place. I whispered to myself, barely loud enough to hear, "Remember this." Because I knew it waited on the ground. Baggage claims, taxi lines, unanswered emails, obligations that never slowed. But this moment, this glowing horizon would stay with me. Proof that change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it rises slowly, quietly, until it floods the sky with light. And as the sun broke free, scattering brilliance across the endless canvas, I realized that this flight had given me something I hadn't expected. Not just miles traveled, not just new coordinates on a map. It had given me a new sky, one that would live inside me, even long after we landed. The sun was fully risen now, a steady blaze that poured itself across the clouds until they glowed like a sea of fire. The cabin, washed in that golden light, seemed to carry a different kind of stillness. Not silence, but a gentle awareness that our time in the sky was nearing its end. People shifted in their seats, stretching, stowing books, finishing drinks. The two friends behind me began to whisper about the city waiting for them. The young mother kissed the forehead of her still sleeping child, smoothing his hair as if to prepare him for arrival. Even the man in the suit across the aisle had closed his laptop for good, staring out the window with an expression I could only describe as reverent. The captain's voice came through the speakers, calm and precise, announcing our descent. The words were routine. Altitude, weather, time of arrival, but they carried weight, like a bell marking the end of a service. The cabin crew moved with quiet efficiency, collecting cups, securing trays, reminding us to fasten belts. Each click of a buckle sounded sharper now, final, as though we were all bracing ourselves not just for landing, but for the return of gravity in more ways than one. I leaned my forehead against the window again, watching as the world reappeared beneath us. At first, it was only a vague smudge of land, blurred by morning haze. Then rivers appeared, winding silver ribbons catching the light. Fields spread out like patchwork quilts stitched in greens and browns. Roads carved across the landscape in straight lines and impossible curves. From above, it all looked fragile, delicate, like a toy version of the place we had left behind. As the plane tilted lower, details sharpened. Houses dotted the ground, small and square, their roofs glowing faintly in the sun. Cars crept along highways like insects, each carrying a story I would never know. Smoke curled from chimneys, hinting at reckless cooking, family stirring. Life was happening everywhere below us, loud, messy, insistent, and I felt a pang at the thought of returning to it. There's always a moment in descent when my chest tightens, not out of fear, but out of reluctance. Up here, above the clouds, I had felt lighter, freer, as though the sky itself had loosened the knots I carried. Down there, the knots waited to tie themselves back in. Yet this time, something in me resisted the sadness, because I realized that change had already happened. The sky had done its work. The engines shifted pitch, the hum deepening as the plane lowered further. The wing outside flexed slightly, adjusting to the air, steady and sure. I closed my eyes and breathed with the motion, letting the rhythm soothe me. I thought about the turbulence, the laughter, the conversations with strangers, the sunrise that had spilled its fire across the horizon. I thought about how for just a few hours, my worries had shrunk to dots on a map, and the vastness outside the window had made space for something new inside me. When I opened my eyes, the ground was close now. Trees swayed in the wind, their branches sharp against the morning light. I could see streets lined with cars, people walking, a dog racing along a path. The ordinary world, so small from above, was rushing back to meet me. And instead of dread, I felt something steadier. A quiet gratitude that I could carry the memory of the sky with me, tucked inside like a secret. The wheel struck the runway with a jolt, a roar of rubber against asphalt. The cabin shook, passengers exhaled in unison, and the engines roared and reversed to slow us down. For a moment, my body was pressed forward against the belt, reminded of the gravity I had escaped only hours ago. Then, with a long sigh, the plane steadied, rolling toward its gate like a giant exhaling after a long effort. Applause broke out somewhere behind me,
scattered but heartfelt. Others laughed softly at it, but I found myself smiling. Maybe it was silly, maybe unnecessary, but it was also human. A small way of saying, we made it, together. As the plane slowed to a crawl, people reached for their bags, phones lighting up with messages waiting impatiently. The world was rushing back in, as it always does. But I stayed still for a little longer, my hand resting against the window, eyes fixed on the sky that was already slipping from view. And I thought, I came back to the ground, but I am not the same as the one that left it. The flight didn't just carry me over distance. It gave me a new horizon, a new sky inside myself. One I'll keep, even here, with my feet planted firmly again.
Arrivals always carry a different weight than departures. The same airport hall, the same polished floors, the same artificial light humming above, but everything feels denser, more hurried. On departure, people dream ahead, their eyes filled with expectation. On arrival, they lean forward, ready to resume, to re-enter, to return. The carousel belts grind and creak, bags tumbling out with dull thuds as hands reach greedily, pulling lives back down to earth. I moved slowly among them, my carry-on rolling faithfully behind me. Around me, the crowd pulsed with impatience, voices overlapping, wheels rattling, phones buzzing, children tugging on sleeves. Yet inside, I carried a stillness that felt almost unshakable, as though I had smuggled a piece of sky inside myself. I found a wide window overlooking the tarmac and stopped, letting the tide of passengers flow past me. Outside, the morning light painted everything with a thin glaze of gold. Planes lined up nose to tail, fuel trucks crawling, workers in bright vests moving like ants in choreographed precision. Another jet turned slowly toward the runway, its engines spooling into a roar. I watched it for a long time, knowing in minutes it would lift off, pierce the clouds, and enter the same vastness we had just left. On board, 100 more strangers would share their own fragile communion. Laughter, silence, perhaps even fear. And some of them, like me, would step off hours later carrying a sky that felt forever altered. The man who had sat beside me passed by, briefcase in one hand, phone pressed to his ear with the other. He was already immersed in his next world, his voice brisk, his steps quick. But for a fleeting second, he lifted his eyes and caught mine. He gave the smallest of nods, the faintest of a wave, a gesture so brief it might have been imagined. Then he was gone, swallowed by the current of travelers. I didn't follow him, didn't call out. Our story belonged to the air, and that was enough. I walked on, past reunions unfolding like small miracles, arms wrapping tightly around shoulders, kisses pressed to cheeks, tears spilling freely in the middle of the terminal. Past business travelers clutching coffees and striding with mechanical purpose, past the weary, dragging themselves toward connections. My feet carried me forward, but my mind was still at 30,000 feet, where the world had looked like a patchwork quilt stitched in light, and problems had shrunk to dots too small to matter. The ground felt heavier than the sky, as it always does, but it no longer pressed on me the same way. Instead of burden, it felt like anchor. I tilted my head back and caught sight of the terminal roof, vast and ribbed with beams and glass. Through it, in patches, I glimpsed the morning sky. To anyone else, it was nothing remarkable. Pale blue, ordinary, the kind of sky you pass under without noticing. But to me, it still glowed with the memory of that sunrise above the clouds, the molten gold spilling across endless white fields. It shimmered, even here, even now. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Messages, reminders, deadlines, voices from the ground tugging me back into the rhythm of ordinary life. I didn't reach for it. Not yet.
I wanted a few more steps of silence, a few more breaths of carrying the sky inside me before the weight of the day reclaimed me. At the sliding glass doors, I paused. Outside was the city, awake and impatient. Cars honked, taxis lined up, people hurried with bags too heavy for their hands. The familiar noise of earth called me forward. And yet, as I stepped out, I carried with me something it could not take. I whispered under my breath, barely louder than a thought. I've landed, but I am not the same. My sky has changed, and I will never look at it the same way again.